Sorry, everyone. Thank you for joining today. This is a meeting of the State Board of Education Work Group on Assessment. We're really glad to have you all here today. I should just note that this meeting is being recorded for both viewing of the public afterwards and also for viewing of the members of this work group who may not be able to attend today. I put it in the chat, but I'll also share that although we are allowing members of the public into this meeting on their phones and some of them in the actual Zoom call, we are not taking public comment at this particular meeting. If you do have comments you'd like to provide, I believe that you all have the State Board public email that was in the public notice. So again, I appreciate your interest, and as this work group moves forward, there will be opportunities for that, I imagine. I'll just briefly say that from that work group right now, we have Director George Russell and Director Jennifer Skurlock on the board side, and then members of our assessment team who will be leading us through a presentation today. And at times they might ask questions of our two directors. I'll just remind folks that, again, this is for the work group to move forward and discuss, not necessarily for members of the public at this time. So appreciate your interest and your willingness to engage. And then I will pass this off to Dan and our assessment team.
Thanks, Corey. Jennifer Patterson is going to get us started in the conversation today, but I did want to give a brief introduction to the teammates that we have here. My name is Dan Farley. I'm the Director of Assessment, and I'm joined today by Tony Bertrand, who's our Social Sciences and ELA Assessment Specialist, Andy Byerly, who's our Math Assessment Specialist, and Equitable Grading Practices Aficionado. Jennifer Patterson, of course, is with us. She is the Assistant Superintendent of the Office of Teaching, Learning, and Assessment. We're also joined by Noelle Gorbett, who is our Science Assessment Specialist today, and Ben Wolcott, who's our English Language Proficiency Assessment Specialist. Not all of us have speaking roles today. Some are here just to make sure if questions that require tremendous detail are opened up, that we can benefit from their respective areas of expertise. Thank you all for coming, and we're looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Dan, and thank you for the invitation and opportunity. We're delighted to be along with you in this learning journey, Director Russell and Director Skurlock. As Dan mentioned, this is the second of a work board learning session around assessment, and we were excited, of course, being the Office of Teaching, Learning, and Assessment. When people want to talk about teaching, learning, or assessment, we get pretty energized. It matters very much, of course, to the well-being of our children, most importantly. And we have a lot of ownership and interest in using this as an opportunity to turn the mirror as well, and to deepen the way we think about our ways of knowing and our ways of doing and our ways of leading in the department, so that they become more reflective of the kind of experience that we want to create for every child, in which they're able to grow into who they're meant to be in this world and life. I read this beautiful article a mother talking about what she aspires for her children, and she talked about that she wants them to experience self-love and to have all the tools and opportunity through their education to know deeply and truly their own value in this life, in this world, and to be able to chart their course and give back to the community. So those are important values for us too, and we definitely want to open this conversation in a way that honors disequilibrium. And we certainly come with a lot of humility around what we don't yet know, and a lot of commitment to re-examine things that we think we know for sure, or that we thought we know for sure. And we know that with that ethos, we can truly be committed to an anti-racist equity way of learning, an equity way of leading that leads us to really redesign paradigms, processes, and patterns in our system to better serve our children. Today, we're going to be talking about a couple of topics, and some of this might be a little redundant if you were part of the initial session with us, and we apologize for that, but it's also pretty hard to talk about where we're going in our vision for assessment for Oregon's students without really talking about an opportunity to revisit our values for rehumanizing assessment and how we are aiming to infuse anti-racist practices into our leadership work and vision for what assessment can be in Oregon. We'll also talk a little about spring 2021 reporting, and if we have time with you today, we'll talk a little about target reports as well. Before I turn it over to Dan, I think that the last thing I want to say is that overwhelmingly, we know that the closer we are to children in the way that we know them, the way that we listen to them, and the way that we teach them, the more they learn and grow, and the more power that they pull and experience in our care. And so we know for sure, and Director Skurlock, who is a brilliant teacher in our midst, and Director Russell, you as well as a former educator, know without question that formative assessment creates the biggest power and footprint for children. And so at the state level, we are consistently looking for ways to increase the footprint of formative assessment and decrease the footprint of summative assessment. So I wanted to open with that idea and leave you with that visual of a big, beautiful footprint of formative assessment and a smaller footprint of summative assessment. All of them matter. They all have a role to play, but really looking towards increasing the way that formative assessment plays a key and priority role in the way we come alongside our children and shine a light on what they can do well and what they're ready to learn next. Dan.
Thank you, Jennifer. I also have to name that I missed an important member of our team, Sudhi Fern, who's our K2 Balanced Assessment Specialist. When I switched my screen view, she got shuffled to the bottom and I just totally skipped her. So welcome to Sudhi as well. Next slide, please. So as Jennifer mentioned, we do want to revisit some of what we discussed at the prior session, of course, because we're also trying to make sure that we're emphasizing themes that play throughout our work. At the prior session, we've discussed quite a bit about how we are trying to rehumanize assessment. That's something that we're doing by acknowledging its roots and the harms that have been perpetuated by assessment practices. But we also want to, of course, get to the point where we can start shifting the discussion to incorporate some of the historical changes that have occurred since the beginnings of standardized testing, some current practices that are in place that are trying to address sources of bias in our systems, and work with you to think about how assessment could be different and shaped to frame possible futures that are more accessible, more inclusive, and more equitable for our students. And we do want to invite the directors to a conversation and a discussion today. So I know that we have content as a team that we would like to share just to build more understanding of the work that we're trying to do and to address the questions that we have been charged with addressing, but we would love to have it be as interactive as possible as well. So the beginning of the conversation was an acknowledgement of the white supremacist history of standardized testing and some of the impacts that has resulted in for our students who are Black and Brown. Standardized norm-referenced assessments have been weaponized in many cases, sometimes intentionally, sometimes unintentionally, to exclude many of our students who are Black or Brown from courses, schools, or other important opportunities in our education and social systems. So norm-referenced assessments are designed to rank student performance in relation to peers as part of a norm group. And norm groups are designed by test vendors to be representative of the national population. So the norm-referenced averages that result from those scales are typically lean toward and are most heavily influenced by the most common, in other words, the most prevalent demographic groups And of course, the averages are the result primarily of the students in the middle of distribution. We know as well that students of color are over-identified as experiencing disabilities at the hands of assessments like this, which are standardized norm reference assessments. These facts are an uncomfortable part of our shared history, and we also acknowledge that many inequities remain in our assessment approaches that we are trying to identify and disrupt. In terms of what is being done to address these concerns, so once we name them, we must do something about them. The assessment team has begun the conversation of our work to rehumanize assessment, to change the deficit-based narratives about test results that are present in our classrooms and in our newspapers, and how we're making new resources available in the area of interim assessments, which are periodic assessments of student learning, and tools for teachers, which are instructional resources that identify what teachers can do next in response to student performance. So we've named prior that assessment hasn't done a good job until recently of answering the so what, now what question. Tools for teachers is part of an answer to that question and the beginning of an answer to that question, and it's exciting. We'll also talk about how we're infusing anti-racist assessment practices as the future of our work, and that connecting with our educators and communities of color to hear their stories and learn from them, as we also share what we know about test design to come to mutual understanding about how to make systems better, more equitable, accessible, and inclusive. I should also name and acknowledge that all of our state summative assessments are, of course, designed to align to our standards. And so there's really no aspect of our approach to instruction that is not worthy of interrogation in this same way. We should also be interrogating the way that we develop standards, which set the instructional targets for teachers and students. We should be looking at curriculum through the same lens, and assessment is part of that conversation, but it's all connected in terms of how students experience learning in our classrooms. So obviously I'm really trying to focus on assessment because that's the charge of our team, but acknowledging at the same time that it's connected to a wider body of work. There also are ways that assessment is conflated with accountability, which I think has its own kind of set of challenges. We're really just talking about assessment and trying to focus on what are the ways that educators gather evidence of student learning. Because without assessment, we might know that there is teaching occurring, but we don't know that learning is occurring. And our job is to make sure that all students are learning and learning what has been defined as priority content. And of course, fully admitting that that process may not have been and probably likely was not as inclusive of cultural perspectives and cultural relevance as it could be if we reconstructed those processes now. So our assessments should be contributing, what we're trying to do is have them contributing to an asset-based framework. Where the conversations start with, hey, here's what you have mastered, here's the next topic that we're going to work on. And it's building from an asset frame, so strength-based framework. Our assessments capture a snapshot of student performance at a point in time and look at summary patterns. They shouldn't be used to define student self-concept. Our assessments are designed to measure achievement, not ability, and using them in discussions about ability or potential is a misuse of our state summative assessment data. We understand too that misuses of assessment data continue to occur, and it's our responsibility to do whatever is in our power to disrupt those practices. I'd like to, at this point, kind of open it up for a little bit more discussion to see if there are any questions about what I just shared. Or any topics that you would like to explore further, or words that are presenting a challenge or a hurdle for understanding, or if there are any experiences or expectations that you would like to bring in the conversation now for the directors.
Sorry, I meant to hit unmute and hit stop video. Dan, just to help me understand a little better, can you talk, and I know you talked about this last week, but how the standardized testing that we do relates to the essential skills requirements?
Mm-hmm. Sure, yeah, I can speak to that. And for reference, Director Russell is referring to the impact of a new Senate Bill 744 that we are working on. So there are different uses of state assessments, and of course, the state summative assessment system that we have in place is defined by federal law that is also supported by state law here in Oregon. One of the areas in which assessments have been used that is not federally required is in the space of a process called the assessment of essential skills. So historically, students in Oregon over the past 13 years have been required to demonstrate proficiency in relation to a set of 9 essential skills that are kind of the state's definition of what well-roundedness was intended to look like. There are multiple ways that students were allowed to demonstrate proficiency in relation to essential skills, and only 3 of those were coordinated at the state level. So reading, writing, and mathematics were the 3 for which a state summative assessment could be used to demonstrate proficiency. And those, of course, were the 3 that got the most statewide attention because of that. The other ways that students were able to meet essential skills included using other standardized assessment options, which had to be approved by a special review panel called the Assessment of Essential Skills Review Panel, composed of measurement experts throughout the state. That was the second way. The third way was through work samples, which were ideally situated within curricular systems at the district level, where students would participate in a performance task or work sample. At the local level, that participation was then scored against an official state scoring guide. So the process was standardized in the sense that it was scored against the same criteria and hopefully in the same manner. But that's how the work samples came into be. There's a fourth option that is rarely engaged because it requires districts to develop their own assessment, and also the technical adequacy documentation related to its use. So they had to come up with and generate reliability studies and validity studies that would support that high stakes use. And most districts don't have the capacity to be able to do that kind of work. There's a long history on every topic I just glossed over, and a lot of, I think, deep questions to each of those pieces. I can share as well that Senate Bill 744 allows us to engage with our communities of color, Oregon tribes, and students to evaluate the assessment of essential skills as a set of policies and practices, and determine where they should be situated within our system, or if they should be situated within our system, and provide recommendations to the legislature and the state board in those spaces by September 1st of 2022. I'll pause there too for questions.
So actually a couple of follow-up questions, some of this which I should know, but I admit that in my growing seniority, I lose some of these things in my memory. The first one is, as I recall, last meeting, you shared some data on the representation within the different assessment groups that you just mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
And that one of those pieces of data was that, and I think this is accurate, that students of color are overrepresented in the category of what's it called? The one you just meant, proficient, not what is it? What
Work samples.
right, work samples. And I don't know if you're going to show that again. So that was one I wanted to make sure that we followed up on at some point. And then this is just a question in terms of, and I don't know this, and I admit that I should, for kids who get opted out, do they have to take some kind of alternative assessment?
Great question. So that, Director Russell, thank you for that. There are a couple layers to unpack to answer that question. So the first thing that I didn't mention clearly is that Senate Bill 744 suspends the requirement that students demonstrate proficiency to get an Oregon diploma through the 2023-24 school year. So the requirements aren't in place right now. It gives us time to conduct the engagement and study. Prior to that, so speaking with a historical lens, students have multiple ways that they can meet or that they could meet the assessment of essential skills requirements. So if their parents chose to opt them out of the state summative assessment, they would pursue one of the other remaining options. So another standardized assessment such as the ACT, SAT, or work keys were common, and work samples were also common. Another kind of complexity that makes the data a little difficult to interpret in some ways is that the way that the data are entered in terms of how the Oregon Department of Education tracks how students meet their essential skills requirements is usually in order. So if a student met their essential skills requirement using the state summative assessment, that was usually what got selected in the data set. If students who didn't even participate in the state summative assessment, sometimes just took the SAT or the ACT, that's what would be selected. And work samples operationally, and we will be collecting information that is hopefully not anecdotal, which is what I will share with you, but more factual based on district surveys as part of this project. But our understanding is that districts basically implemented the assessment of essential skills as sort of a filtration process. So if students weren't able to pass their state summative assessments, then they would look toward other standardized assessments as an option. And if those weren't possible for the student to pass, then they would default to work samples. And my understanding is that was not the intention of the framers of the essential skills, nor was it the intention that we focus exclusively on the three content areas. They wanted it to be more work samples driven, and they also were hoping that it would cover all 9 areas with the same level of attention, which it didn't, the way it was implemented. Okay.
Thank you, Director
And-
Spurlock.
Director Skurlock.
Okay. Jennifer, do you have Jennifer Patterson? Do you have anything to add before we transition to Jennifer Skurlock's question?
No, I just saw her hand and wanted to make sure that people had noted that. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dan, and thank you, Jennifer. So I just have a quick question. Actually, George Russell asked questions, and Dan, you answered some of the questions concerning the requirements as far as SAT, ACT, work keys, and then the work samples being added in that. And so is there a certain score? This is the only part I couldn't remember. Is there a certain score that students have to receive on the ACT or SAT in order to have the graduation requirements covered? So I just wanted to check on that data. Thank you.
Sure, great question, Director Skurlock. Thank you. So ODE actually conducted studies that are called equating studies that harken back to the days of Oaks when the original proficiency requirements were established. So our psychometricians basically take results from all of the assessments that are under review and compare them back to the proficiency expectation that was established in Oaks. So back in the 2013-14 timeframe. And the cut scores on each of those assessments is set in relation to that same level, so that they, statistically speaking, denote an equivalent level of performance. There also, the assessments were reviewed in terms of how well they represent each of the, I'm going to have to use some of the fancy language, but constructs, or content areas. They were reviewed by our team for how well each of those assessments represent the content area that it's assessing, to make sure that the comparisons aren't just statistical, but content driven as well. And so there are different cut scores for each of the assessments, and we used to publish tables of all of the equivalent scores across each other standardized assessment as well as part of that work. All right. Thank you for both of those questions. All right, and again, please feel free to stop and ask questions or seek clarification as we go through. So this slide really kind of is a reminder slide about the three core ideas that frame the assessment team's vision and values for assessment. We already mentioned that we're trying to rehumanize our practices. We're also working with Oregon's districts to implement balanced approaches to assessment. So as Jennifer Patterson mentioned, that our systems have been imbalanced for many years. Summative assessment has been literally the only possible discussion point because it was the only resource that we made available statewide. That's no longer the case. We now have an interim assessment system and tools for teachers that we make available statewide. But we remain committed to truly the juice and the fuel of assessment, which is formative assessment practices, which I would also call high leverage instructional practices. Oftentimes when we use the word assessment, it doesn't convey the full complexity that we're trying to get at within that formative assessment discussion. It's actually a multi-dimensional instructional practice supported by about 30 years of research that fuels student learning. So our work on summative assessment, our work in the interim assessment space is really trying to make sure that our educators can see the through line that we discussed, and we'll see that graphic again here in a little bit, that connects students to standards so that we're implementing a system that can be self-informing. Oh yeah, and we'll try to monitor the chat as well and answer questions that way if that is more digestible. All right, next slide, please. So this is a reminder of something that Chair Howard Wade mentioned that she valued, which is putting back some of the joy in the human experience. So the strength-based approach that we're trying to work on, which starts at what students are good at and helping identify their next learning move. We're hopeful too that this can create joy in terms of a sense of accomplishment and self-discovery. It also, of course, can be a sobering moment depending upon how the assessment process results. But perseverance and identifying your next learning move so you always have a way forward can really be the best way to support our students, and we're certainly dedicated to that. Next slide, please. So as we shared this graphic before, but our work at ODE, we understand influences multiple levels in our education systems, from districts to schools to classrooms and individual students. We are trying to do work that will make sure that all students get support in developing the knowledge and skills they need to pursue their post-secondary dreams, and also understanding and naming that their post-secondary dreams are different and should be replete with personal agency and identity. So we're really trying to focus in on how students experience our assessment systems and what they can teach us as we work forward as well. Next slide, please. So this slide is just a reminder of an assessment landscape that we are really trying to leave behind, where students can be and were dehumanized, to a different future where student agency and identity are honored across all of our assessment practices. I'm going to turn the discussion over to Sodi now, who will discuss some of the procedures and work that we're moving forward to help address some of the concerns that the work group has shared around test design and item development. So,
thank you, Dan. I do appreciate the opportunity to speak to the work group, and I want to say thank you to my colleagues for giving a rookie some space to speak with you as well. We are continuing to learn about how to infuse anti-racist assessment practices in our efforts. We continue to inform our own perspectives so that when we notice racist policies and practices, we can then move to disrupt them. As a late poet and activist, Maya Angelou has stated time and time again, do the best you can until you know better. Then when you know better, do better. This quote and notion of continuous improvement has been both a personal and professional endeavor for me. And I will be sharing some work that the assessment team is doing to be more anti-racist. On this slide, we talk about Oregon State's assessment system. We know that we have a great deal of work to generate and evolve more shared understanding about assessment in Oregon for all users of the information. While there are concerns about biases in test development, and they remain, we also know that we can help improve them. As much as possible, we invite affinity groups to help with the item review process so educators of color might feel less pressure to conform to group expectations, and incorporating diverse members in our advisory committees. The greatest impact we can make is to our work to increase appropriate uses of data and decrease the inappropriate uses. It is primarily how adults use the data that the tests generate that weaponize assessment practices. As a BIPOC woman, I recognize that I have felt joy and benefited from systems use of assessment data, but I also know that I've fallen prey to the misuse of them too. There have been assumptions made about my ability, and I definitely have been tracked about my abilities, and were given classes at the high school level that were well below what I could do just based on one score. Thank you. One way to disrupt the misuse of assessment is by centering student voice in our student assessment system, or state assessment system, sorry. This should allow for more focus on student experiences within our education systems. Extending our discussion about the quality of our educational approaches beyond academic outcomes to include the ways that we are investing in our students and the quality of student instructional experiences. And I know Dan has something else to offer on the slide.
thanks, Adi, and thanks for sharing your experiences too. It's super powerful to hear, especially for folks like me whose identity and agency has always been, reinforced by the assessments that I've taken, and assessment has opened doors for me almost exclusively. It's important to be mindful that others don't share that experience. The reason that I am coming in to explain or to address this particular topic is it has to do with the last bullet and how we have a group of measurement experts from across the country that are called our Technical Advisory Committee. And they are literally national experts in multiple assessment domains. One of the ways that we are trying to kind of intrapersonally get better is by engaging in and digesting anti-racist literature, including anti-racist assessment literature. That's both as persons and as a team. The other way that we're trying to shift our systems to make sure that we continue to stay mindful of and press ourselves to change practices, so to identify racist practices and disrupt them, is by adding expertise on our technical advisory committee in that space. So we have, for this coming year, we have been able to connect with a national expert on anti-racist assessment practices, and we'll continue to engage with that professional throughout the coming years to help us interrogate our system and make it better so that it doesn't continue to purvey the harms that it has, even up to the present.
Thank you, Dan, for sharing your expertise with that. That was something that I didn't know a whole lot about, and I wanted to make sure that we got it right. Next slide, please. The assessment team continues to work on reducing biases within our state assessment system. We've researched and developed a plan to honor proficiency for students in high school who are taking our English language proficiency assessment, which is also known as ELPA. If all goes as expected, students will not have to retake the assessment domains where they have already demonstrated proficiency in grades 9 through 12. For example, if a ninth grader takes the ELPA summative assessment and earns a proficiency score in listening and reading, the student would not have to retake those assessment components as a sophomore. The proficient score will be carried forward. We feel that this is a big win for Oregon's high school students who are emerging bilinguals. We've also added accessibility options for the coming year, including supports for math manipulatives as a designated support and embedded text-to-speech as a designated support and speech-to-text as an accommodation where allowable. That functions similarly to tools that students use in classrooms. Thus far, as we've been meeting with educators, the feedback has been positive as our assessment will include accommodations that mirror what classrooms are using. And finally, I want to highlight one more activity we are doing for users to infuse anti-racist assessment practices in classrooms. The team will be working alongside districts to implement equitable grading practices, a partnership which serves to make grading practices more sound and founded in student mastery at a classroom level. Our hope was to gather 20 teams across the state. Each team would be comprised of teachers, an administrator, and a team lead. However, it was reported to us this morning that we will launch this work with 34 teams across the state next week. This is an exciting opportunity as we look to partner with professional learning teams as they learn, include, and share more anti-racist assessment grading practices in their classroom. We acknowledge that there is still much more work to do, and we are committed to understanding more, listening more, and assisting in building a shared understanding of assessment in effort to being more anti-racist. I'm going to pause there and ask if there are any questions or comments or recommendations that the work group would like to discuss. And if not, I'll turn it over to Dan.
Looks like a question from Director Skurlock.
Hi, thank
Hi.
you, Lori, and thank you so much, Sodi, for your presentation. I have a couple of questions around or I guess maybe requests from the equitable grading practices. Right now, I'm teaching AP English Language and Composition, and then Ethnic Studies 101, and then I'll teach World Literature, and I teach English 11. One of the things I would love to see is common rubrics or scoring guides that will help students to transition from high school and move right into the college level expectation, and to see what that looks like as far as what the expectations are. So I know I've taught IB, International Baccalaureate, in preparation for the IB exam for literature and things like that. One thing that I love is our state with Common Core covers a lot of the standards that are included for AP and IB, but they're worded in different ways. And sometimes the kids get stuck behind the vocabulary difference. And so which ends up causing problems as far as it appears that the kids don't know certain things, but they do. They just use different vocabulary to describe some of the same things. And so we see that as a hindering block for students, and it's not fair. And so just trying to see if there are ways that we could look more closely on what students are being asked to do through, if it's as they get into high school and transitioning to college, so that we can make sure that the transition is easy for them to be prepared and be able to thrive in college or whatever path that they choose. And so that's that I'm finding that the lack of equitable practices often comes through the vocabulary issues, different acronyms for describing the same task, but using different words. And so it appears again that a kid is not knowledgeable, but then I'll give them a different synonym and they'll say, oh, I know what you're talking about. It's like, yeah, you do. I know you do. But because there's all this different vocabulary, it's a stumbling block. And I just want to make sure that our state is aware of that so that we can interject and make changes so that kids can thrive and not think that they're stupid or incompetent, because they're not. They're just hearing different vocabulary describing the same things, and it's causing unnecessary confusion. So just wanted to put that out there as something hopefully that we can engage in conversations about for our students across the state. Thank you.
Thanks, Director Skurlock. No, I know and I'm aware that AP exams and the IB program have really robust assessment systems in place, and I know that we could certainly participate in conversations about how to make sure that there's consistency in vocabulary or glossaries or something to that effect. It's not an area of work that is like directly on our plates, but certainly the work that Andy Byer is leading around equitable grading practices is gathering districts, leadership teams together to work on mutual problems like that. So hopefully that'll be the beginning of a vehicle and a system that can help us help you in spaces like that. A lot of the work that we're talking about today, we don't have funding to do, and we don't have authority to support. So that has been a challenge, and we haven't let that stop us necessarily. The equitable grading practices discussion, for example, was a situation where districts came to us asking us to be thought partners. So it's been a really, it's been a district-led process, and we have no official regulatory or statutory authority to be involved in those discussions. Nonetheless, we're working with our districts as thought partners. We were able to organize some resources across the Office of Teaching, Learning, and Assessment with Dell, who is sponsoring school-based teams. Sorry, I misrepresented that, not district-based teams. So we're working with some partners to bring a little funding and expertise to that conversation. But it's the beginning of a very long conversation, I'm quite sure, and kind of beautiful partnerships there. One thing that Sodhi didn't talk about, and probably because she didn't want to sing her own praises, but we're also engaged in some work at the request of the state board, of course, around the kindergarten assessment and kind of reviewing the historical practices therein, engaging with communities, especially communities of color and Oregon tribes and families, to re-envision and redesign the kindergarten assessment going forward. So that's something that absolutely could have been on these slides, and is part of our ongoing effort to engage with our communities and be at the same table and learn from them. Any other questions up to this point?
Dan, I guess I do have a question. Is it possible, as we have representation with for these amazing groups that will be meeting, that we do include, so it would be elementary, middle school, and high school, but making sure that we have representation if it is from a college now teacher or AP teacher, or IB teacher in different subject areas, just to help as far as the issue around equitable grading practices and how it impacts all students, especially our students of color. And so I was wondering if that's a possibility, because having 34 teams is amazing. But trying to see if we can be strategic about who's in the room and being able to have those conversations to hopefully address some of these issues that are creating barriers that people may not intend to create barriers, but again, they are barriers there that need to be addressed. So just wondering about that. Thank you.
Thanks, Director Skurlock, for that question. I'm going to start by framing the engagement itself, but then I'm going to ask Andy Byerly, who's actually leading that work, to speak more directly to what he knows about the landscape. The thing that I understand about the process and how 34 teams were engaged is it was based on commitment and availability. So they reached out to us. So it wasn't a strategic implementation from our part. It's more of those who expressed interest and wanted to commit as a school level team to that work. So Andy, if you wanted to speak into that a little more deeply, I'd be happy to turn the mic over to you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Dan. And thank you for the question and the interest, Director Skurlock. We're really excited to be able to partner with so many teams to do this work. One of the most common questions we're getting from the folks that have signed up is around that transition between high school and higher ed. And it's not at the grain size that you're speaking of in terms of rubrics and clarity. It's more just around how do we, if we make a change to our grading practices, how do we indicate that on a transcript? Those are the level of concern that and just curiosity that the folks are having so far. We have not, I appreciate the idea of strategizing around a connection to higher ed. That has not been a part of our planning currently, but I will take that back to the planning team. One thing I will share is that we have a 5-person small but mighty internal ODE team that is leading this work or helping to lead it. One of our specialists is our accelerated learning specialist, Dr. Christadel McGregor, and she is very well connected to the HEC and to our higher ed organization. So we definitely have on our planning team the right person in the room to strategize.
All right. Thank you, Andy. I'll pause just a little bit more to make sure we've addressed any questions that Director Skurlock or Russell have. Okay. Now I'll extend it for Zoom wait time. I don't see anybody reaching for a mute button, so I'm gonna go ahead and advance to the next slide. All right. Over the summer, in response to the survey, this is a little bit of a shift in topic now. Of course, just kind of transitioning to the next question that you asked. You expressed an interest in understanding how state academic achievement data are reported and used. The SEED survey that Noelle described at our last session is, of course, designed to change the landscape in that conversation by centering student experience of our education systems within our assessment program. Of course, our long-term plan is to make SEED survey data publicly available as well, which has a kind of minor accountability role. But the way that we've envisioned the SEED survey working is not through the accountability arm, but through the arm which actually defines what kinds of changes could be made, what levers could be looked at and pulled to change the outcomes that our systems continue to generate by centering what students are telling us about their educational experiences. So we're really excited about that. And our reporting for state assessment data for spring 2021, which is the context in which this conversation will occur. For now, we can expand that if you have questions that go outside of last spring's participation and reporting. Our reporting will focus on the utility and hoped for uses of the SEED survey, which we just completed the first year pilot for in spring 2021. All right, next slide, please. So public reporting of state academic participation and performance data is a critical arm of federal accountability requirements from the Every Student Succeeds Act, particularly as it is required that these data be reported in multiple student groups, including by race, ethnicity. So this structure of reporting calls attention to student groups whom our education systems are not serving well as student groups whom our systems are serving well. And Oregon educational administrators typically use the data to determine how well their school level, district level curricula and instructional practices, as well as professional development work is working at the systems level. ODE also uses the data to help determine how to equitably distribute resources to schools and districts where they're needed most. We also know, as we shared above, that state assessments have been used in dehumanizing ways, and we need to work with all of the adults in our systems to change the narrative and set new weather in the classroom when we talk about what assessment results mean, what they don't mean, how they should and should not be used, and what they do and do not say about students, including when they touch on topics such as student ability. So again, part of our reporting for spring 2021 data will be kind of more centrally locating the SEED survey data and results. We will talk about the results that we got from spring 2021. As is likely expected, we had a pretty substantial reduction in participation rates across the state. I know that you all were following the waiver discussion. We ended up being required to administer a subset of the federally required assessments. So in the areas where we didn't require testing, we had participation rates that were close to 0%. At grade 3, we had participation rates as high as 35% in terms of state averages in English language arts. And that participation rate slowly atrophied across grades up until grade 11, where we only had about 11% of our students participating. So as you might imagine, given those low participation rates, we're quite concerned about the data in terms of performance being publicly shared and being used inappropriately. So we'll be developing guidance and caveats around what story the data do tell and what story the data cannot tell because of the participation limitations that we experienced. So that will be in some ways a complicated and technical challenge for us, but we have also consulted with our technical advisory committee and gotten some kind of clear rules of thumb that we can share with the public once we do get to the point of publicly disseminating those data. And I'll stop there to see if there are any questions that go beyond the information that I shared with you.
Dan, this is George. Do you have an approximate timing on that? Is that sometime soon or later?
Great question, Director Russell. Thank you. The current plan is to publicly report our spring 2021 summative assessment data by October 7th, so early October. Director Scott.
Sorry, thanks, Corey. Sorry, Dan. I just want to be respectful and not just jump right in. Okay, so you did mention, you said about 11% of students 10% of students who are 11th grade level participated in the statewide assessments. Is that correct, Dan?
It was 11% at the high school level in English language arts and mathematics. So 11-11.
Okay, 11-11. Okay, thank you for sharing that. And has there been any, have students or families shared specifically why? Has there been anything that has come up as far as students taking the SAT or ACT, so not feeling that it's valid to take an additional testing? Or I'm just kind of curious about that, and will those questions be asked with families and community students, families and communities, those types of questions? Thank you.
Thanks, Director Skurlock. I actually don't have a direct source of information to kind of substantially address that question. We typically don't collect information for assessments that we don't design and implement or sponsor. So that would be the ACT and SAT would be in that space. We, of course, track how they are and are not being used by Oregon's public universities. I think that announcement was widely distributed last October that Oregon's public universities and colleges are test optional now. I'm sure that has an impact on family and student decision-making for those students who plan to attend an Oregon public university or college. But I don't have direct information and don't connect to families about their decision-making in that space because it's not a state summative assessment.
Thank you for sharing that. I was just kind of curious. It's come up in conversations with students, and that has been one of the things that's come up, saying I'm already taking the SAT or I'm already taking the ACT, so there's no need for me to take the additional test. But I wasn't sure if there was any reporting out on any of that, so that makes total sense. Thank you.
And Director Skurlock, I will also share that the tension in that conversation was historically referenced to the requirement that students demonstrate proficiency in the assessment of essential skills. So that discussion, those discussions won't be the same, at least for the coming 3 years while we evaluate that practice as a state.
Thank you, Dan.
All right. All right, I think I will next turn it over. So Director Pinner, actually, we watched the video of the prior engagement just to make sure that we were really tracking the questions that you had and the topics that you shared were interesting to you and for us to look at next. One of Director Pinner's questions was what kinds of ways can school boards in Oregon approach state summative assessment data that can allow them to be in a better position to determine how to meet student learning needs in their district. So immediately in my mind, I was making connections with a set of resources that we call target reports. And part of our work in rehumanizing assessment, as I mentioned, is to try to decrease, of course, the inappropriate uses of state summative assessments where they're serving as gatekeepers for programs or used for students at the individual level with high stakes associated with them. That work is obviously continuing, and the assessment of essential skills is part of that conversation. But we also wanted to talk about the ways that we are working with schools and districts to appropriately use state summative assessment data. And at the same time, kind of acknowledging the ways that we have reported the data in the past and the levels at which we've reported those data haven't been as actionable as the resources that we'll share with you today. I also want to name that we wouldn't have started with target reports as the focus of our conversation, understanding that we're trying to get away from having summative assessments always capture the space when we connect with each other. But talking about target reports today with you really lays the foundation and the groundwork in terms of vocabulary and systems that we will need in order to explain and connect with you later on our interim assessment system and our tools for teachers. And then, of course, point to the work that we've done on formative assessment practices. So we're sharing target reports with you today more as a means to an end, but also as an important feature in the work that we're trying to do and addressing the question that was levied at me when I first started at ODE almost 4 years ago, which is that the state summative assessment data are useless to me as an educator. I can't use them. Percent proficient, like what do I do with that? So this is part of an answer to that question. It can be coordinated at the district level and at the school level and even at the classroom level. And it looks at patterns across time. We're also trying to make sure that we reinforce appropriate uses of data. And when you're looking at data from 1 year, you of course have volatility in determinations around those data because they can be affected by cohort and a bunch of other environmental factors that kind of can change from year to year. So the target reports that we'll position and discuss with you today look at 3-year trends in the data. Because of that, they're able to kind of show you where patterns might be the result of noise. Like this is a pattern that doesn't seem clear to me, so I probably don't know whether I should trust it or not. This pattern is established and it goes back 3 years. So it's immune to cohort effects. It's immune to which classroom teacher may have been in place. And it is a system level concern that probably points to a curriculum or instructional need. So that's an important kind of back story for the target report discussion that we'll have. Hopefully with the visuals that we'll provide and some of the detail, it won't be overwhelming, but I did want to have you all keep in mind that it's a means to a longer conversation. It's not an end in and of itself. Hopefully that's acceptable. Thank you. All right, and with that, I will ask for the next slide and turn the mic over to Tony and Andy, who are going to handle the next session.
And before we start that, just a quick note on time. So we are about an hour in. We have about 23 minutes left before we've hit that block. And so just to note that this conversation, very useful, very helpful. But this meeting is not the last meeting of this work group. There will be more time for discussion and whatnot. So if questions feel particularly time sensitive, I'd welcome them in this space. But just a reminder that we are running a little short on time and questions can be addressed at future meetings as well.
And Corey, thanks for that pause. One option for Director Scurlock and Director Russell to consider is to not start the target report discussion as well. There is no way we can cover it in 22 minutes in full transparency. We could start a conversation and end it where time stops, or we could lean in more deeply to some of the topics that we've already covered either during the first session or during this session, or questions that you have that you would like us to address in the now.
Dan, my recommendation is we make use of the time we have, and maybe we're just selective about the big ideas and highlight those, because both Director Scurlock and Director Russell, apologies, I was wanting to call you George. Both Director Russell and Director Scurlock have the slide deck. And so that would be my recommendation, that we just are judicious with picking what are the most important ideas we want to highlight. Let's highlight those.
That sounds great. And I'll lean on Tony and Andy's expertise to try to kind of distill the most salient features of the target report structure to you. Excellent. And then we, of course, as Corey mentioned, are happy to come back and engage with the board and additional members and get deeper on the resource that we'll share with you here shortly at a future date. Tony, does that ask?
Yeah, okay. I think we're good. And we'll at least do an introduction, and it may pose future reflection, which will then lean into future discussion at the same time. So this is a shift again, and this is in response to one of the comments from our last engagement, which was perhaps a need to provide not only district support, but support to school boards and an overview of how the summative assessment data could actually be leveraged to help and improve and evaluate the system at the local level. As Dan mentioned, one of the common comments that we hear is the data from our summative assessment is not useful to our classroom educators, and what we like to show as an alternative perspective in looking at the data, not at its highest level, but looking down into the components of the summative assessment data. So we've engaged in both some internal and external discussions on how to leverage the most useful components of the summative assessment and making those direct connections to local systems and the associated academic standards that are reflected in Oregon's summative assessment. So on the next slide, a visual that we've used in the past in our last engagement was the different dimensions of assessment. And again, they each serve a specific purpose. And the summative assessment is just one of those assessment dimensions that we try to leverage, as Dan has mentioned, interim as well as formative assessment practices. And as this image displays, the assessment ranges all the way from the far left of formative assessment practices, which is those minute-by-minute observations at the classroom level, and then going through those standards through the dimensions of the summative assessment at the very end, which captures and informs how the educational system writ large supports students around the entirety of those grade level standards. And again, all too often, the data from the summative assessment is viewed only from that very large overview lens of a percentile and a proficiency percentile by grade. And when we further analyze the information at the local level, we start to see the components that are the most usable from those results to really guide systems improvement. So what Andy is about to walk us through is he's going to walk us through a brief example of how we have worked directly with ESD partners and districts to identify how to leverage the usable data within our summative assessment through the different degrees and levels. So I will pause there and turn it over to Andy after one more. So next slide, please. So our claim really is to look beyond this overall percentile of proficiency and look further into the summative assessment. And again, soon we're going to demonstrate our example. And as Dan mentioned, really, we look at those 3-year trends of target level data from summative assessment that provide an accessible and efficient tool for engaging in those actionable district and school improvement efforts. And again, as we will show in what we hope is a future work group engagement, we'll make those connections that Dan mentions to the interim assessment system that will hopefully serve as a bridge from classroom formative assessment practices to those end of year grade level standards as mentioned and measured by our summative assessment. I'm going to turn it over to Andy. So Andy, please go ahead and introduce and take over.
All right, thank you, Tony. And good afternoon again. So we have spent a lot of time emphasizing the need to humanize assessment. And why are we talking about summative? Well, Dan mentioned earlier that we do have some federal requirements there, but also we know that classroom assessment practices vary by educator. And we need to have some sort of data that helps us dive into our system. And so often the measurements of our system health are used in ways that become extremely high stakes for students. I've seen this as a math specialist happen all the time, right? Historically, students are sorted into tracks of different classes based on their summative assessment score. And you heard my colleague Sodi share very vulnerably about that earlier today. So to be clear, this practice of ranking and sorting is malpractice. And we have a responsibility to use the results of these statewide assessments for their intended purpose, which is to evaluate our systems of teaching and learning. So while we are championing the need to humanize assessment, we also recognize that we need a way to evaluate the health of our systems. So we know that Director Penner couldn't join us today, but hopefully we can return and spend some more time on this. But what would this look like in a district or school? So for the next few minutes, we're gonna collectively pretend that we are an 8th grade math professional learning team, or perhaps a district data team that is curious about what we can celebrate about our system, as well as what opportunities exist. We need some information to look at our instructional materials. Are they effective? Perhaps it's the timing and the pacing of our units and how we're teaching. Perhaps there's professional development, both around instruction, perhaps around content knowledge that our educators need. So if you will indulge us for a bit of simulation here, we're going to pretend that we're an 8th grade team. So Noelle, let's go to the next slide and we'll dive in. Thank you for driving the slides, by the way, Noelle. We've determined she has the best Wi-Fi of all of us, and so to avoid an interruption. We're going to get into a few slides that are technical, so please do stop at any point if we can clarify or give more information. We're going to talk about target data, and I'd first like to define that term. Earlier this month, my colleague, Dr. Mark Freed, presented to the full state board the revised Oregon math standards. This slide shows a clipping from the grade 8 standards, where you can see the standards listed in black font and the headings listed in blue font. The headings represent clusters of big ideas. So you'll notice that multiple standards are bundled into these groups. This is what we mean by a target. That's the assessment term that we use, but these come directly from the standards. So that's an important term. One very practical note. One of our priorities is keeping our summative assessments as efficient as possible. And if we were to try to assess every student on every individual target, that would not be efficient and would be horrible educational practice. What we can guarantee is that every student can interact with items from each target. So that's an important element of the design of our assessments, and one that actually gives us some of the most usable data that we have to work from. So Noelle, if we can go to the next slide. As you know, Oregon publishes at-a-glance profiles as part of our public accountability system that Dan mentioned earlier. And these include high-level achievement data in several key areas. The profile that we're showing here does represent an actual district. We have redacted the name. Most of these measures show the percentage of students meeting statewide grade level expectations. We can see too that we can look at performance by various student groups, but we're really left with this question of how can we better serve the 65% in this case of the students, of the 8th graders in our district that are not yet at this level, right? How do we know where to go from here? So we need to take a deeper dive here. So Noelle, next slide. All right, so as we begin to dig deeper, it's like, we use that icon of a telescope, right, for summative assessment. It's like focusing that telescope on a clearer image. This district's at-a-glance profile showed 35% of grade 8 students scoring at a level 3 or higher. It shows up here at a 36% just due to some rounding. What we historically refer to as meeting grade level is a level 3 or higher. Notice in this case that when we start to dig deeper, the first thing we look at are the fact that we have just as many, 36%, that are scoring at a level 1 as we do that are scoring at a level 3 or 4 combined. So one really important use of our summative data is to identify system-wide inequities and really raise those with a sense of urgency. We are not serving a huge percentage of our students. That should alarm us, right? So as we continue to dig deeper, we need to figure out how to take some relevant action. So Noelle, on the next slide, this is where we get into target level data. And this is a very busy slide, but just the rows of this table represent those targets that I showed you earlier, those big ideas of our math content standards. And the columns of data, the first set of symbols represents the performance of this group of students. So again, all of the 8th graders in our district represents their performance relative to that grade level expectation. So a plus is they're exceeding the grade level expectation in that particular target. An equal sign means they're at or near, and a minus means they're below. So we want to allow our eyes to jump to the pluses, right? Because those are worth celebrating. We also want to spend some time being really curious about the minuses. And that second column of data, thank you, Noel, that second column of data gives us another lens just to know this is a relative strength or a relative weakness. So a plus would be a relative strength for this group of students. A minus would be a relative weakness. So
Andy, can I interrupt for a minute just to model the way that we're like working in real life time to really refine and get clear with our words, because it's not a weakness for this group of students. It's a weakness for the system, and it's reflection. It's a mirror about what they're being taught and what they have an opportunity to learn. So we really want to shift the focus. The summative assessment is about the ownership of the quality of the teaching and the consistency of the teaching at this high level in alignment with the standard. And so it's less about what the children can do. That's an important idea, but it's really shifting ownership in thinking about what does this tell us about the quality of the teaching. And that's really the richness of the target reports, is it helps teachers and principals supporting teachers in professional development practice their ability to teach at a deeper, higher level to these standards so that students learn more. So I just wanted to make that clarification that we're really wanting this not to be about what students can and can't do. This is really about what opportunities for learning are teachers creating in the classroom that are at consistent alignment with what the standards are asking of the children, so that when they have an opportunity to show what they know, that it reflects the opportunity of the teaching that they've been provided.
Yeah, thank you, Jennifer. That's what I get for going off my script and defaulting back to some of those.
No, it's all good. I know that's what we mean, and I really care about us, practicing with each other how we're, in real time shifting and nudging and pushing on the words we choose, because they matter and they reflect what we really are wanting to push on in the system.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So with that reframed system orientation, our team here, that is our district data team, perhaps, is going to be really curious about the ways in which our system is failing our students for this particular target. And when we start to look at the language of the target, is when we can really connect back to the standards, which is what we know our educators are familiar with, right? We speak, we eat, live, drink, breathe the language of the standards, right? When it comes to our academic responsibility. So we might choose to dive into this particular target and really start to ask some heavy questions. Noelle, if you go forward one slide, and I think 2 more animations here. Yeah, there we go. When we start to look at this target level data across years is really when we start to get the clearest picture of those trends and those patterns that are emerging in our system. Because if we look at data from 1 year, we can ask, is our system behaving this way due to some cohort effect of students? As opposed to looking at a 3-year trend where we can be pretty sure that our system is failing students across, we're not setting students up for success. If we're expecting to see pluses where we've seen minuses for 3 years, it's just not going to happen, right? So this is the level of data that our summative assessment system currently provides. We are in the process of working with districts and schools every opportunity we can to begin to, as Jennifer just modeled with us, reframe the way we talk about our standard, our summative assessment, as well as how do we take action here. So I'm going to turn it back over to Tony just to talk briefly about what we might do with this information relative to our system when we are curious about it. So Noel, we're going to actually skip the next slide and move straight here. Yep, perfect.
Thanks, Andy. And I do want to reiterate, we are talking about systems here of using the summative assessment, evaluating how our system is or is not serving the needs of our students. And so when we dive deeper beyond just that composite score, we can start making connections to learning targets, priority standards, or in English language arts, they would be the anchor standards, and the subset of standards that are connected to those learning targets and those anchor standards. So in working with districts, we've identified the top 3 uses of using target reports and starting the process of evaluating how their local system is functioning in support of students. And we want to recognize there are many more actionable steps than considerations. And we are just presenting these, both the technical and adaptive challenges, as some of the top 3 uses. But again, there are multiple other considerations. From the feedback from districts that we've been able to work with, they have chosen the pathway that best meets their local context. So they may start at use 1, 2, or 3 based on their needs. So once districts see and start to analyze their target level reports, the actionable part of our summative assessment, they can start to ask the following questions and reflect. 1, is our teaching and learning system aligned to the standards? And so this might be evaluating the instructional materials that they have adopted throughout the district, and whether that's the State Board of Education's recommended list or from the district's independent adoption process, and comparing those materials to other national evaluation organizations such as EdReports is one organization that does this on a national level. This is now a reflective opportunity for a district to engage in based on their summative assessment results at a target level. The second one is we've collaborated with multiple states on appropriate uses of target level data. And using the following image that we're going to display, this image is borrowed from the Connecticut Department of Education. And another common technical question that a district could ask is our pacing appropriate? And this may entail looking at course maps, academic calendars, assessment calendars, and bringing all of those into coherence and alignment. And we were doing this presentation at an ESD, and in one presentation, an educator reflected on the targets that they were looking at, and they commented that they didn't know that the specific standards of one of the priority targets was a priority in mathematics. And in that realization, all they needed to do was just change their course map and their unit of study to take place earlier in the school year. And so we found that to be, usable for educators when they make those connections in looking beyond just that composite score. There are also adaptive challenges that need to be addressed, and questions such as the following. Is our instruction effective? And this includes being culturally relevant and representative at the same time in our instructional practices. So districts and schools could find patterns in which educator professional development is needed, or serve as a launching point for professional learning teams to engage in discussions around effective and culturally relevant instruction. And are educators familiar with the success criteria to leverage their formative assessment practices for those minute-to-minute reflections? Because now they're making connections to historical data, how that's represented in their assessment targets, and how that's connected to the standards and the language that educators are using in the classroom level, and the language that they're using with students in the classroom level. And again, we're happy to pause for discussion. I know we're pressed at time to provide clarification, so this may just be a reflection point. But we can go ahead and come back and circle back to those technical and adaptive challenges. or we're prepared to pose some questions to the board on some next actionable steps of how we can also come back and better plan and support future engagement opportunities. So again, I know we jumped into a technical component, and we really do appreciate your time, and thank you again.
Thanks, Tony. If you could advance to the next slide, Noel. And I do want to certainly honor everyone's time, but wanted to center as well on questions that the directors have that we can prepare to address when we meet next. So certainly want to be connecting with you all and the other members in that conversation so that we can support your decision-making as well as we can. There are also 2 slides that come after this in the slide deck that we want to draw your attention to. The first is a set of assessment resources that elaborate the work that we've done to expand the footprint of our state assessment resources. And then the final slide is a thank you slide that has contact information, so email addresses that are linked within there. So I might ask Corey and directors to develop a structure that we could collect your questions, because I definitely want to not hold you any longer from getting along to your weekend. I am happy to stay, of course, if you want to voice your questions, and I can record them, but don't want to have you beholden to the process anymore.
Yeah, appreciate that, Dan. And Director Skurlock and Russell, if you have any immediate reflections, I'd welcome them here as well. As far as that structure that Dan mentioned, there are other members who are not in attendance today, but will be reviewing the recording. And so I think we'll also be sending an email to collect feedback, both from both of you, but also from both of them. So that structure exists, so no pressure to get it out right now. And as Director Russell mentioned, it can be valuable to have that time to digest, because we are we held more time this time, but we still ran to time. And like I said at that first meeting, this is a very large topic, and taking time to really consider and think about it feels entirely warranted. Director Russell, yeah, please.
Yeah, and I don't want to prolong this, and just for something for Dan and Jennifer and folks to be thinking about when we next come, because I think it'll be important to have some of our other directors both view this presentation and have the opportunity to think about things. But one of the things, Dan, you may want to think about is what is the appropriate role of the department in working with school districts around interim assessment.
Yeah, I appreciate that question, Director Russell, and that's definitely something that our teams can think about and for response and for potential discussion at a future meeting. Director Skurlock, please.
Sure. Thank you so much for the presentations. Some of the questions I have has to do with pacing and building. So as far as what students need to be able to do at the first grade level, second grade level, third grade level, all the way through 12th grade, but specifically on how much time, because we're looking at is our pacing appropriate? I'm thinking of that specific question. We know when kids return back to school, they need review time and then build time. And oftentimes we have kids rotating from one district to another, one part of the state to the other. And so when we check to see where kids are at the beginning of the school year, it's a challenge as far as, okay, how do I reevaluate my plan to make sure that it's appropriate pacing for the skill set that's in my class right here at the beginning of the term, and then revisiting information. And I think that's one of those things that teachers need, I guess you could say, help and guidance, because we want to support all students who are thriving at this point, students who are novice learners that are getting to the point of raising. But when we talk about that type of pacing, and then the tests are holding us accountable to some type of pacing, how do we support educators in that process when they're working one-on-one with the students that are in multiple different levels? And so just something to unpack. And I don't know if there's a perfect answer clearly for that, but just putting that in the space, because it is something that comes up every single year and oftentimes every single term as students are relearning information and then rebuilding and then relearning and building. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Director Russell and Director Skurlock. Recorded those questions and will certainly come prepared to address them at the next engagement.
Okay. Director Russell.
I just want to thank everybody for this session. I think it's been very helpful, and also to our folks who are listening in, and I hope that they realize they can send an email or a comment, and that board directors will review those and look at those and try to make sure we get them answered.
I want to thank you, Director Russell and Director Skurlock, for the time you're volunteering to be part of this conversation. I really appreciate your commitment to the conversation, and we'll certainly work our tails off to get you the answers that you deserve.
Okay, well, again, appreciation to everyone for joining, both members of the work group, but also members of the public. Again, I'll share again, this meeting has been recorded. It will be posted and made publicly available. And yeah, as we think about where this work group goes, I'll be following up with a doodle poll to identify the next meeting date, and we'll send public notice once that's landed. So appreciation for everyone again, and hope you all have a good night.